Thus, the sight of the road of bones stretching over the prairie was a shock. Maybe roads of bones were all that was left. The thought gave the very emptiness of the plains a different feel. With those millions of animals gone, and the Indians mostly gone in their wake, the Great Plains were truly empty, unpeopled and ungrazed. Soon the whites would come, of course, but what he was seeing was a moment between, not the plains as they had been or as they would be, but a moment of true emptiness, with thousands of miles of grass resting unused, occupied only by remnants of the buffalo, the Indians, the hunters. Augustus thought they were crazed remnants, mostly, like the old mountain man who worked night and day, gathering bones to no purpose. "No wonder you never worked out in Waco, Os," he said, speaking as much to himself as to the old man. Os Frank was not in a talkative mood or a listening mood either. He had filled his wheelbarrow and was heading back to camp. "I'm going to the walls to kill that big renegade for you," Augustus said. "Need anything?" Os Frank stopped as if thinking it over. "I wished they hadn't killed that dog," he said. "I liked that dog. It was them Kiowas that killed it, not the Mexicans. 6 Kiowas. "Well, I got 6 bullets, Augustus said. "Maybe I'll send the rascals where your dog went." "Them Kiowas shot Bob's horse," Os said. "That's how come they caught him. Built a fire under him and cooked him. That's their way." Then he lifted his wheelbarrow full of bones and walked off toward the Canadian River. The light was just coming, the plains black in the distance, the sky gray where it met the land. Though dawn was his favorite hour, it was also an hour at which Augustus most keenly felt himself to be a fool. What was it but folly to be riding along the Canadian River alone, easy pickings for an outlaw gang, and hungry to boot? A chain of follies had put him there. Call's abrupt decision to become a cattleman, and his own decision, equally abrupt, to try and rescue a girl foolish enough to be taken in by Jake Spoon. None of it was sensible, yet he had to admit there was something about such follies that he liked. The sensible way, which he had pursued once or twice in his life, had always proved boring, usually within a few days. In his case, it had led to nothing much, just excessive drunkenness and reckless card-playing. There was more enterprise in certain follies, it seemed to him. As the sun lit the grass, he rode east along the road of buffalo bones. Chapter 55. Monkey John hated it that she wouldn't talk. "By God, I'll cut your tongue out if you ain't going to use it," he said once, and he knocked her down and sat on her, his big knife an inch from her face, until Dogface threatened to shoot him if he didn't let her be. Lorena expected him to do it. He was the worst man she had ever known, worse even than Ermok and the Kiowas, though they were bad enough. She shut her eyes, expecting to feel the knife, but Dogface cocked his pistol, and Monkey John didn't cut her. He continued to sit on her chest, though, arguing with Dogface about her silence. "What do you care if she talks?" Dogface said. "I wouldn't talk to you either, you goddamn old runt." "She can talk, goddamn her," Monkey John said. "Duck said she talked to him." "It's her business if she don't want to talk," Dogface insisted. He was a thin scarecrow of a man, but he had crazy eyes, and Monkey John never pushed him too far. "By God, we bought her," Monkey John said. "Give all them hides for her. She ought to do what we say." "You get your damn money's worth," Dogface said. "Most of them hides was mine anyway. You old runt," he added. Monkey John was old and short, his hair was a dirty white, and he was under 5 feet, but that didn't keep him from being mean. Twice he grabbed sticks out of the fire and beat her with them. There was nothing she could do but curl up as tight as she could. Her back and legs were soon burned and bruised, and she knew Monkey John would do worse than that if he ever got her alone long enough. But Dogface owned half of her, and he stuck close to be sure his investment didn't get too damaged. Though she had seen Dogface and Monkey John give Blue Duck the skins in trade for her, it seemed they weren't full owners, for whenever the Kiowas showed up every 2 or 3 days, they drug her off to their camp for their share, and the 2 white men didn't try to stop them. There was no love lost between the white men and the Kiowas, but both sides were too afraid of Blue Duck to get into it with one another. Blue Duck was the only man of the bunch who seemed to take no interest in her. He had stolen her to sell, and he had sold her. It was clear that he didn't care what they did to her. When he was in camp, he spent his time cleaning his gun or smoking, and seldom even looked her way. Monkey John was bad, but Blue Duck still scared her more. His cold, empty eyes frightened her more than Monkey John's anger, or Dogface's craziness. Blue Duck had scared the talk completely out of her. She had never been much for talk, but her silence in the camp was different from her old silence. In Lonesome Dove she had often hidden her words, but she could find them if she needed them. She had brought them out quick enough when Jake came along. Now speech had left her. Fear took its place. The 2 white men talked constantly of killing. Blue Duck didn't talk about it, but she knew he could do it whenever it pleased him. She didn't expect to live to the end of any day. Only the fact that the men weren't tired of her yet kept her alive. When they did tire, they would kill her. She thought about how it would happen, but couldn't picture it in her mind. She only hoped it wasn't Blue Duck that finally did it. She was so dirty and stank so that it seemed strange the men would even want to use her. But of course they were even dirtier and stank worse. They camped not far from a creek, but none of the men ever washed. Monkey John told her several times what he would do to her if she tried to run away. Terrible things, on the order of what Blue Duck had threatened on the morning after he kidnapped her, only worse if possible. He said he would sew her up with rawhide threads so tight she couldn't make water, and then would watch her till she burst. Lorena tried to shut her mind when he talked like that. She knew the trick of not talking and was learning not to hear. At night, she wondered sometimes if she could just learn to die. She wanted to, and imagined how angry they would be if they woke up one morning and she was dead so they could get no more from her. But she couldn't learn that trick. She thought of being dead, but she didn't die, and she didn't try to escape either. She didn't know where she was, for the plains stretched around empty and bare as far as she could see. They had horses, and they would catch her and do something to her, or else give her to the Kiowas. Monkey John threatened that, too, describing what the Kiowas would do if they got the chance. At night, that was mostly what the men talked about, what the Indians did to people they caught. She believed it. Often, with the Kiowas, she felt a deep fright come over her. They did what they wanted with her, but it wasn't enough. She could see them looking at her after they finished, and the looks made her more scared even than the things Monkey John threatened. The Kiowas just looked, but there was something in their looks that made her wish she could be dead and not have to think about it. Blue Duck came and went. Some days he would be there at the camp, sharpening his knife. Other days he would ride off. Sometimes the Kiowas went with him. Other days they sat around their camp doing nothing. Monkey John swore at them, but the Kiowas didn't listen. They laughed at the old man and gave him looks of the sort they gave Lorena. It wasn't only women they could do things to. One day the Kiowas found a crippled cow left by some herd. The cow had a split hoof and could barely hobble along on 3 legs. The Kiowas poked it with their lances and got it in sight of camp. Then one hit it in the head with an axe, and the cow fell dead. The Kiowas split open the cow's stomach and began to pull out her guts. They sliced off strips of the white guts and squeezed out what was in them, eating it greedily. That's what he said he'd do to me, Lorena thought. Pull out my guts like that cow. Look at them dern gut-eaters, Dogface said. I'll be derned if I'd eat guts raw. You might if you was hungry, Monkey John said. They ain't hungry. They got the whole cow, Dogface pointed out. If there was hope for her, Lorena knew it lay with Dogface. He was rough and crazy, but he wasn't hard like the old man. He might cuff her if she disappointed him, but he didn't beat her with hot sticks or kick her stomach like the old man did. At times, she caught Dog-Face looking at her in a friendly way. He was getting so he didn't like Monkey John to hurt her or even touch her. He was cautious about what he said, for the old man would flare up in an instant, but when Monkey John bothered her, Dog-Face got restless and would often take his gun and leave the camp. Monkey John didn't care. He played with her roughly whether anyone was in camp or not. One night, Blue Duck rode in from one of his mysterious trips with some whiskey, which he dispensed freely, both to the two white men and to the Kiowas. Blue Duck drank with them, but not much, whereas in an hour, Monkey John, Dog-Face, and the Kiowas were very drunk. It was a hot night, but they built a big campfire and sat around it, passing the bottle from hand to hand. Lorena began to feel frightened. Blue Duck had not so much as looked at her, but she felt something was about to happen. He had several bottles of whiskey, and as soon as the men finished one, he handed them another. Monkey John was particularly sloppy when he drank. The whiskey ran out of the corners of his mouth and into his dirty beard. Once he stood up and made water without even turning his back. "You could go off a ways," Dog-Face said. "I don't want to sit in your piss." The old man continued to make water, most of it hitting the campfire and making a spitting sound, but some splattering on the ground near where Dog-Face sat. "I could, but I ain't about to," the old man said. "Scoot back if you're afraid of a little piss." Blue Duck spread a blanket near the fire and began to roll dice on it. The Kiowas immediately got excited. Ermok grabbed the dice and rolled them several times. Each of the Kiowas had a try, but Monkey John scoffed at their efforts. "Them gut-eaters can't throw dice," he said. "You better be quiet," Blue Duck said. "Ermok wouldn't mind frying your liver." "He tries it, and I'll blow a hole in him you could catch rainwater through," Monkey John said. "Let's gamble," Blue Duck said. "I ain't had a game in a while." "Gamble for what?" Dog-Face asked. "All I got is my gun, and I'd be in pretty shape without that, or my horses." "Put up your horses, then," Blue Duck said. "You might win." Dog-Face shook his head. "I don't know much," Dog-Face said, "but I know better than to bet my darn horses. There ain't nowhere to walk to from this Canadian that a man can get to on foot." Yet an hour later, he lost his horses to Blue Duck. Monkey John lost his on the first roll. Before long, Blue Duck had won all the horses, though many of the Indians were so drunk they hardly seemed to know what was happening. Blue Duck had a heavy, square face. He kept shaking the dice in his big hand. Sometimes he would play with a strand of his shaggy hair as a girl would. Sometimes Lorena thought maybe she could grab a gun and shoot him. The men left their rifles laying around. But the gun hadn't worked when she tried to shoot Tinkersley, and if she tried to shoot Blue Duck and didn't kill him, she would be in for it. She might be in for it anyway, though it seemed to her the men were scared of him too. Even Monkey John was cautious when Blue Duck was around. They might be glad to see him dead. She didn't try it. It was because she was so frightened of him that she wanted to, yet the same fright kept her from it. "Well, now I've won the livestock," Blue Duck said. "Or most of it." "Most of it? Hell, you've won it all," Monkey John said. "We're stuck on this goddamn river." "I ain't won the girl," Blue Duck said. "A woman ain't livestock," Dog-Face said. "This one is," Blue Duck said. "I've bought and sold better animals than her many times." "Well, she's ours," Monkey John said. "She's just half yours," Blue Duck reminded him. "Ermok and his boys own a half interest." "We was aiming to buy them out," Dog-Face said. Blue Duck laughed his heavy laugh. "By the time you raise the money, there won't be much left to buy," he said. "You'd do better to buy a goat." "Don't want no goddamn goat," Dog-Face said. He was nervous about the turn the conversation was taking. "Let's gamble some more," Blue Duck said, shaking the dice at Ermok. "Bet me your half interest in the woman. If you win, I'll let you have your horses back." Ermok shook his head, looking at Lorena briefly across the campfire. "No," he said. "We want the woman." "Come on, let's gamble," Blue Duck said, a threatening tone in his voice. All the Kiowas looked at him. The two white men kept quiet. The Kiowas began to argue among themselves. Lorena didn't understand their gabble, but it was clear some wanted to gamble and some didn't. Some wanted their horses back. Ermok finally changed his mind, though he kept looking across the fire at her. It was as if he wanted her to know he had his plans for her, however the game turned out. All the Kiowas finally agreed to gamble except one, the youngest. He didn't want it. He was skinny and very young-looking, no more than 16, but he was more interested in her than the rest. Sometimes in the Kiowa camp he had 2 turns or even 3. The older men laughed at his appetite and tried to distract him when he covered her, but he ignored them. Now he balked. He didn't look up, just kept his eyes down and shook his head. The Kiowas yelled at him, but he didn't respond. He just kept shaking his head. He didn't want to risk his interest in her. "That damn chigger's holding up the game," Blue Duck said to Ermok. He stood up and walked a few steps into the darkness. In a minute they heard him making water. The Kiowas were still drinking whiskey. Now Ermok was in the mood to gamble, and he reached over and shook the young man, trying to get him to agree, but the young man looked sullenly at the ground. Suddenly there was a shot, startling them all, and the young man flopped backwards. Blue Duck stepped back into the firelight, a rifle in his hands. The Indians were speechless. Blue Duck sat down, the rifle across his lap, and rattled the dice again. The young Indian's feet were still in the light, but the feet didn't move. "By God, life's cheap up here on the goddamn Canadian," Monkey John said. "Cheap, and it might get cheaper," Blue Duck said. Then the gambling started again. The dead boy was ignored. In a few minutes, Blue Duck had won her back. Not only what the Indians owned, but what the white men owned, too. Dogface didn't want to play, but he also didn't want to die. He played and lost, and so did Monkey John. "I think you're a goddamn cheat," Monkey John said, drunk enough to be reckless. "I think you cheated me out of our horses, and now you've cheated us out of this woman." "I don't want the woman," Blue Duck said. "You men can have her back as a gift, and your horses too, provided you do me one favor." "I bet it's a hell of a big favor," Dogface said. "What do you want us to do, attack a fort?" Blue Duck chuckled. "There's an old man following me," he said. "He went west, but he'll be coming along one of these days. I want you to kill him. Hear that, Ermok?" he added. "You can have your horses back and the woman too. Just kill that old man. I hear he's coming down the river." "I'd like to know who you hear it from," Monkey John asked. "He's been following me ever since I stole the woman," Blue Duck said. "He ain't no tracker, though. He went off across the Kitake, but now he's figured it out and he'll be coming." "By God, he must want her bad to come all this way," Monkey John said. "Kill him tomorrow," Blue Duck said, looking at Ermok. "Take some of the horses and go find some help." Ermok was drunk and angry. "We do it," he said. "Then we take the woman." "The hell you will," Dogface said. "We're in on this, and she's half ours, and you ain't taking her nowhere." "You shut up, or I'll kill you like I killed that chigger," Blue Duck said. "You get some help," he said again, looking at Ermok. "I doubt you 5 can kill that old man." "Hell, what is he?" Monkey John said. 5 against 1's nice odds." "These 5 can't shoot," Blue Duck said. "They can whoop and holler, but they can't shoot. That old man can." "That makes a difference," Dogface agreed. "I can shoot. If he gets past Ermok, I'll finish him." "Somebody better settle him," Blue Duck said. "Otherwise you'll all be dead." The Kiowas stood up and dragged the dead boy away. Lorena heard them arguing in the darkness. Blue Duck sat where he was, his rifle across his lap. He seemed half asleep. Monkey John got up and came over to her. "Who is this old man?" he asked. "You got a husband?" Lorena stayed in her silence. It infuriated Monkey John. He grabbed her by the hair and cuffed her, knocking her over. Then he grabbed a stick of wood and was about to beat her with it when Dogface intervened. "Put it down," he said. "You've beat her enough." "Let her answer me, then," Monkey John said. "She can talk. Duck says so." Dogface picked up his rifle. Monkey John still had the stick. "You'd pull a gun on me over a whore?" Monkey John said. "I ain't gonna shoot you, but I'll break your head if you don't let her be," Dogface said. Monkey John was too drunk to listen. He charged Dogface and swung the stick at him, but Dogface wasn't as drunk. He hit Monkey John with the barrel of his rifle. The old man went loop-legged and dropped his stick. Then he dropped too, falling on the stick. "I'd have let him beat her," Blue Duck said. "I ain't you," Dogface said. In the night, Lorena tried to sort it out in her mind. She had been hungry so much, tired so much, scared so much that her mind didn't work well anymore. Sometimes she would try to remember something and couldn't. It was as if her mind and memory had gone and hidden somewhere until things were better. Dogface had given her an old blanket. Otherwise, she would have had to sleep on the ground in what was left of her clothes. She wrapped the blanket around her and tried to think back over the talk. It meant Gus was coming. It was Gus Blue Duck wanted the Kiowas to kill. She had almost forgotten he was following her. Life had gotten so hard. The Kiowas had been sent to kill him, so Gus might never arrive. It was hard to believe that Gus would get her out. The times when she had known him had been so different from the hard times. She didn't think she would ever get out. Blue Duck was too bad. Dogface was her only chance, and Dogface was scared of Blue Duck. Sooner or later, Blue Duck would give her to Ermok, or someone just as hard. If that was going to happen, it was better that her mind had gone to hide. In the gray dawn, she saw the Kiowas leave. Blue Duck talked to them in Indian talk and gave them some bullets to kill Gus with. He woke Dogface and shook Monkey John more or less awake. "If he gets past Ermok, you two kill him," he said. Then he left. Monkey John looked awful. He had a bloody lump on his head and a hangover. He had slept with his face in the dirt all night, and an ant had stung him several times, leaving one eye swollen nearly shut. He got to his feet, but he could hardly stand. "How's he think I can shoot?" he asked Dogface. "I can't see but from one eye, and it's the wrong eye." "Put some mud on it. It's just ant bites," Dogface said. He was cleaning his gun. Chapter 56. Augustus was a little put out with himself for doing such a poor job of tracking. He had gambled on Blue Duck heading west, when in fact he had crossed the Red and gone straight north. It was the kind of gamble Call would never take. Call would have tracked all the way, or let Dietz track. The country near the Canadian was rough and broken, and he dropped south to where the plains flattened out. He wanted to spare his horse as much as possible. He rode east all morning, a bad feeling in his heart. He had meant to catch Blue Duck within a day, but he hadn't. The renegade had out-traveled him. It would have been rough on Laurie, such traveling. He should have borrowed Call's mare, but the thought hadn't occurred to him until too late. By this time, Laurie could be dead or ruined. He had helped recover several captives from the Comanches in his rangering days, and often the recovery came too late if the captives were women. Usually their minds were gone, and they were only interested in dying, which they mostly did once they got back to people who would let them die. He was thinking about Laurie when the Indians broke for him. Where they had hidden he didn't know, for he was in the center of a level plain. He first heard a little cutting sound as bullets zipped into the grass, 10 yards from his horse. Later, the sound of bullets cutting grass was more distinct in his memory than the sounds of shots. Before he really heard the shots, he had his horse in a dead run, heading south. It seemed to him there were 10 or 12 Indians, but he was more concerned with outrunning them than with getting a count. But within minutes he knew he wasn't going to be able to outrun them. He had pushed his horse too hard and soon was steadily losing ground. There was plenty of ground to lose, too. He had hoped for a creek or a bank or a gully, something he could get down into and make his stand. But he was on the flat prairie as far as the eye could see. He contemplated turning and trying to charge through them. If he killed 3 or 4, they might get discouraged. But if there was even one man among them with any sense, they'd just shoot the horse, and there he'd be. He glimpsed something white on the prairie slightly to the east and headed for it. It turned out just to be more buffalo bones, another place where a sizable herd of animals had been slaughtered. As Augustus raced through the bones, he saw a wallow, a place where many buffalo had laid down and rolled in the dirt. It was only a slight depression on the plain, not more than a foot deep, but he decided it was the best he was going to get. The Indians were barely a minute behind him. He jumped down, pulled his rifle and cartridge rolls clear of the horse, and dropped them in the buffalo wallow. Then he drew his knife, wrapped the bridle reins tightly around one hand, and jabbed the knife into the horse's neck, slashing the jugular vein. Blood poured out, and the horse leaped and plunged desperately, but Augustus held on, though sprayed with blood. When the horse fell, he managed to turn him so that the horse lay across one end of the wallow, his blood pumping out into the dust. Once the horse tried to rise, but Augustus jerked him back, and he didn't try again. It was a desperate trick, but the only one he could think of that increased his chances. Most horses shied from the smell of fresh blood. He needed the horse for a breastworks anyway, and could have shot him, but he had saved a bullet, and the blood smell might work for him. As soon as he was sure the horse was beyond rising, he picked up his rifle. The Indians were shooting, though still far out of effective range. Again he heard the zing of bullets cutting the prairie grass. Augustus rested the rifle barrel across the dying horse's withers and waited. The Indians were yelling as they raced down on him. 1 or 2 carried lances, but those were mainly for show, or to puncture him with if they caught him alive. Sure enough, when they were 50 or 60 yards away, their horses caught the first whiffs of fresh blood, still pumping from the torn throat of the dying horse. They slowed and began to rear and shy, and as they did, Augustus started shooting. The Indians were dismayed. They flailed at the horses with their rifles, but the horses were spooked. 2 stopped dead, and Augustus immediately shot their riders. He could have asked for no better target than an Indian stopped 50 yards away on a horse that wouldn't move. The 2 men dropped and lay still. Augustus replaced the 2 cartridges and wiped the sweat out of his eyes. The blood had bought him a chance. Without it, he would have been overrun and killed, no matter how fast or well he had shot. Now the Indians were trying to force their horses into a charge, but it wasn't working. The horses kept swerving and shying. Some tried to circle to the south, and when they turned, Augustus shot 2 more. Then one Indian did a gallant thing. He threw a blanket over his horse's head and got the confused horse to charge blind. The man seemed to be the leader. At least he carried the longest lance. He charged at the wallow, rifle in one hand, lance in the other, though when he tried to lever the rifle with one hand, he dropped it. Augustus almost laughed, but the Indian kept up the charge with only a lance, a brave thing. Augustus shot him when he was no more than 30 feet away. He let him get that close in hopes of grabbing his horse. The Indian fell dead, but the horse shied away, and Augustus didn't feel he could afford to chase him. The remaining Indians were discouraged. 5 Indians were dead, and the battle not 5 minutes old. Augustus replaced his cartridges and killed a 6th as the Indians were retreating. He might have got 1 or 2 more, but decided against risking long shots when his situation was so chancy. There might be more Indians available nearby, though he considered it unlikely. Probably they had charged with all they had, in which case he had killed half of them. With no shooting to do for a little while, Augustus took stock of the situation and decided the worst part of it was that he had no one to talk to. He had been within a minute or 2 of death, which could not be said to be boring exactly, but even desperate battle was lacking in something if there was no one to discuss it with. What had made battle interesting over the years was not his opponents, but his colleagues. It was fascinating, at least to him, to see how the men he had fought with most often reacted to the stimulus of attack. P.I., for example, was mostly concerned with not running out of bullets. He was extremely conservative in his choice of targets, so conservative that he often spent a whole engagement sighting at people but never pulling the trigger. "Could have wasted a shell," he said, if someone pointed this out to him. It was true that when he did shoot, he rarely missed, but that was because he rarely shot at anything over 30 yards away. Call was interesting to observe in a battle, too. It took a fight to bring out the fighter in him, and a fighter was mostly what he was. Call was a great attacker. Once the enemy was sighted, he liked to go after them, and would often do so in defiance of the odds. He might plan elaborately before a battle, but once it was joined, his one desire was to close with the enemy and destroy him. Call had destruction in him and would go on killing when there was no need. Once his blood heated, it was slow to cool. Call himself had never been beaten for good. Only death could accomplish that. And he reasoned that if an enemy was alive, he wasn't beaten either, not for good. Augustus knew that reasoning wasn't accurate. Men could get enough of fighting and turn from it. Some would do almost anything to avoid the fear it produced. Dietz understood that. He would never fire on a fleeing man, whereas Call would pursue a man 50 miles and kill him if the man had attacked him. Dietz fought carefully and shrewdly. He would have known the trick about fresh blood. But Dietz's great ability was in preventing ambushes. He would seem to feel them coming, often a day or two early, when he could have had no particular clues. "How'd you know?" they would ask him, and Dietz would have no answer. "Just knew," he said. The 6 remaining Indians had retreated well beyond rifle range, but they weren't gone. He could see them holding council, but they were 300 yards away, and the heat waves created a wavery mirage between him and them. Unless there were more Indians, Augustus didn't consider that he was in a particularly serious situation. It was hot, and the blowflies were already buzzing over the horse blood, but those were trivial discomforts. He had filled his canteen that morning, and the Canadian was no more than 10 miles to the north. More than likely, the Indians would decide they had missed their big chance and go away. They might try to get him at night, but he didn't plan to be there. Come dark, he would head for the river. All afternoon, the 6 Indians stayed where they were. Occasionally, they would fire a shot his way, hoping to get lucky. Finally, one rode off to the east, returning about an hour later with a white man who set up a tripod and began to shoot at him with a .50 caliber buffalo gun. That was an inconvenient development. Augustus had to hastily dig himself a shallow hole on the other side of the horse, where the blood and the blowflies were worse. They were not worse, though, than the impact of a .50 caliber bullet, several of which hit the horse in the next hour. Augustus kept digging. Fortunately, the man was not a particularly good shot. Many of the bullets sang overhead, though 1 or 2 hit his saddle and ricocheted. Once, when the buffalo hunter was reloading, Gus took a quick shot at him, raising his barrel to compensate for the range. The shot missed the white man, but wounded one of the Indian horses. The horse's scream unnerved the shooter, who moved his tripod back another 50 yards. Augustus kept low and waited for darkness, which was only another hour away. The shooter kept him pinned until full dark, but as soon as it was too dark to shoot, Augustus yanked his saddle loose from the dead mount and walked west, stopping to take what bullets he could salvage from the men he had killed. None had many, but one had a fairly good rifle, and Augustus took it as insurance. He hated carrying the saddle, but it was a shield of sorts. If he got caught in open country, it might be the only cover he would have. While he was going from corpse to corpse collecting ammunition, he was startled to hear the sudden rattle of shots from the east. That was puzzling. Either the Indians had fallen to fighting among themselves, or someone else had come on the scene. Then the shots ceased, and he heard the sound of running horses, the Indians leaving, most probably. This new development put him in a quandary. He was prepared for a good hard walk to the river, carrying a heavy saddle, but if there were strangers around, they might be friendly, and he might not have to carry the saddle. Possibly the scout for a cattle herd had stumbled into the little group of hostiles, though the main trail routes lay to the east. At any rate, he didn't feel he should ignore the possibility, so he turned back toward the shooting. There was still a little light in the sky, though it was dark on the ground. From time to time, Augustus stopped to listen, and at first heard nothing. The plains were still. The third time he stopped, he thought he heard voices. They were faint, but they were white, an encouraging sign. He went cautiously toward them, trying to make as little noise as possible. It was hard to carry a saddle without it creaking some, but he was afraid to put it down for fear he could not find his way back to it in the dark. Then he heard a horse snort and another horse jingle his bit. He was getting close. He stopped to wait for the moon to rise. When it did, he moved a little closer, hoping to see something. Instead, he heard what sounded like a subdued argument. "We don't know how many there is," one voice said. "There could be 500 Indians around here for all we know." "I can go find them," another voice said. It was a girlish voice, which surprised him. "You hush," the first voice said. "Just because you can catch varmints don't mean you can sneak up on Indians." "I could find 'em," the girlish voice insisted. "They'll find you and make soup of you if you ain't lucky," was the reply. "I don't think there's no 500, a third voice said. "I don't think there's 500 Indians left in this part of the country." "Well, if there was even 100, we'd have all we could do," the first voice pointed out. "I'd like to know who they were shooting at when we rode up," the other man said. "I don't believe it was buffalo, though I know it was a buffalo gun." Augustus decided he wouldn't get a better opportunity than that, so he cleared his throat and spoke in the loudest tones he could muster without actually shouting. "They were shooting at me," he said. "I'm Captain McCrae, and I'm coming in." He took a few steps to the side when he said it, for he had known men to shoot from reflex when they were frightened. Nothing was more dangerous than walking into the camp of a bunch of men who had their nerves on edge. "Don't get nervous and shoot. I'm friendly," he said, just as he saw the outline of their horses against the sky. "I hate this walking around in the dark," he added loudly. Not that it was much of an observation. It was designed to keep the strangers from getting jumpy. Then he saw 4 people standing by the horses. It was too dark to tell much about any of them, but he dumped the saddle on the ground and went over to shake hands. "Howdy," he said, and the men shook hands, though none of them had yet said anything. The surprise of his appearance had evidently left them speechless. "Well, here we are," Augustus said. "I'm Augustus McCrae, and I'm after an outlaw named Blue Duck. Have you seen any sign of the man?" "No, we just got here," one of the men said. "I know about him, though," July said. "My name is July Johnson. I'm sheriff from Fort Smith, Arkansas, and this is my deputy, Roscoe Brown." "July Johnson?" Augustus asked. "Yes," July said. "By God, that's a good one," Augustus said. "We were expecting you down in Lonesome Dove, and here you are practically in Kansas. If you're still after Jake Spoon, you've missed him by about 300 miles. "I have more urgent business," July said rather solemnly. To Augustus he seemed young, although it was hard to tell in the dark. Mainly it was his voice that seemed young. "I see you brought family," Augustus said. "Most lawmen don't travel with their children. Or did you pick up these 2 sprats along the way?" Nobody answered. They simply stood as if the question was too complicated for an answer. "Did the Indians kill your horse?" July asked. "No, I killed him," Augustus said. "Used him for a fort. There ain't much to hide behind on these plains. I heard shooting. Did you kill any more of them bucks?" "Don't think so," July said. "I might have hit the buffalo hunter. We never expected to find Indians." "I killed 6 this afternoon," Augustus said. "I think there was 12 to begin with, not counting the buffalo hunter. I expect they work for Blue Duck. He stole a woman, and I'm after him. I think he sent them bucks to slow me down." "I hope there ain't too much of a bunch," Roscoe said. "I never killed one before." In fact, he had never killed anyone before, or even given the possibility much thought. Sudden death was not unknown in Fort Smith, but it was not common either. It had been a big shock when the Indians turned their guns on them and began to shoot at them. Not until he saw July draw his rifle and start firing did it dawn on him that they were under attack. He had hastily drawn his pistol and shot several times. It had not affected the Indians, but it angered July. "You're just wasting bullets. They're way out of pistol range," he said. But then the Indians ran, so it didn't matter so much. "What's your plan, Mr. Johnson?" Augustus asked politely. If your business is urgent, you might not want to slow down long enough to help me catch this blue duck." That was true. July didn't want to slow down at all until he found Elmira. If he had been alone, he would have traveled 20 hours a day and rested 4. But he was hardly alone. Roscoe was nervous as a cat and spent all day talking about his worries. Joe didn't complain, but the hard traveling had worn him out, and he rode along in a doze most of the time and slept like a dead thing when they stopped. The only one who didn't suffer from the pace was Janey, who mainly walked. July had to admit that she was unusually helpful. When they stopped, she did whatever chores there were to do without being asked. And she was always up and ready to leave when he was, whereas Joe and Roscoe were so sluggish in the morning that it took them half an hour just to get their horses saddled. Now, out of the blue, a Texas Ranger had showed up, one of the very ones who had partnered with Jake Spoon. He was afoot and a long way from help, and they couldn't just ride off and leave him. Besides, there were hostile Indians around, which made the whole situation more worrisome. "I haven't planned very much," July said honestly. "Seems like every time I make a plan, something happens to change it." "Well, life's a twisting stream," Augusta said. "Speaking of which, the Canadian River ain't but a short way to the north. Them bucks are probably camped somewhere on it." "What would you advise?" July asked. "You know the country." "It's a steep-banked river," Augusta said. "If we have to fight Indians, we'd be in a lot better position there than out on this plain." "You say the man stole a woman?" July asked. "Yes," Augusta said. "A girl who was traveling with us." "We best go on to the river, I guess," July said. "You can ride with me, and Roscoe can tote your saddle." "If this boy ain't armed, maybe he'd like a rifle," Augusta said. "One of them bucks I shot had a pretty good Winchester, and this boy looks old enough to shoot." He handed the rifle to Joe, who was so stunned by the gift that he could barely say thank you. "Is it loaded already?" he asked, rubbing the smooth stock with one hand. "You darn right it's loaded," Augustus said. "Just make sure you shoot one of them and not one of us." He climbed up behind July, and they all rode north. Joe felt intensely proud now that he was armed. He kept one hand on the stock of the rifle, expecting that any minute the Indians might attack. But the ride to the river was uneventful. It seemed they had not been riding long before they saw the silver band of the river in the moonlight. July stopped so abruptly that Joe almost bumped into his horse. He and Mr. McCrae were looking at something downriver. At first, Joe couldn't see anything to look at, but then he noticed a tiny flame of light far downriver. "That'd be them," Augustus said. "I guess they ain't worried about us, or they wouldn't be so bold with their campfire. They don't know it, but the wrath of the Lord is about to descend upon them. I dislike bold criminals of whatever race, and I believe I'll go see that they pay their debts." "I'd best go with you," July said. "You don't know how many there are." "Let's go make camp," Augustus said. "Then we'll think it out." They rode upriver a mile, stopping where the mouth of a canyon sloped down to the riverbed. "This is as good as we'll get," Augustus said. "What I'd like is the loan of a horse for the night. I'll have him back by breakfast, and maybe a few others to boot." "You want to go at them alone?" July asked. "It's my job," Augustus said. "I doubt there's many of them. I just hope Blue Duck is there." Roscoe could not believe what he was hearing. He felt very scared as it was, and yet this stranger was preparing to ride off by himself. "Why, there could be 10 of them," he said. "Do you think you could kill 10 men?" "They're easier to scare at night," Augustus said. "I expect I'll just run most of them off. But I do intend to kill Mr. Duck if I see him. He stole his last woman." "I think I ought to go," July said. "I could be of some help. Roscoe can stay here with the young ones." "No, I'd rather you stay with your party, Mr. Johnson," Augustus said. "I'd feel better about it in my mind. You've got an inexperienced deputy and 2 young people to think about. Besides, you said you had urgent business. These things are chancy. You might stop a bullet and never get your business finished." "I think I ought to go," July said. It was in his mind that Ellie could even be in the camp. Somebody could have stolen her as easily as the Texas woman. The whiskey traders wouldn't have put up much fight. Of course, it wasn't likely she was there, but then what was likely anymore? He felt he ought to have a look at least. In any case, the man could use help, and it should be no great risk to leave Roscoe and the young ones in camp for a few hours. They all needed the rest. Augustus realized he could probably use help, since he didn't know how many men he was facing. However, he didn't have a high opinion of the average man's ability as a fighter. The majority of men couldn't fight at all, and even most outlaws were the merest amateurs when it came to battle. Few could shoot well, and even fewer had any mind for strategy. The problem was that Blue Duck was evidently one of the few who could think. He had planned the theft of Lorena perfectly. Also, he had survived 20 years or more in a rough country, at a rough game, and could be expected to be formidable if he was around. But probably he wasn't there. Probably he had sold the woman and left, sending a few Kiowas down the trail to take care of whoever came along. It would likely just be a matter of shooting down 2 or 3 renegade buffalo hunters who had been too lazy to find honest work once the herds petered out. Augustus was undecided as to whether he would be better off by himself or with a country sheriff from Arkansas. All he knew about the sheriff was that Jake Spoon had run from him, which wasn't much to go on. The young man had had no experience with plains fighting, and perhaps not much with any fighting. There was no telling if he could even take care of himself in a scrape. If he couldn't, he would be better left. But then, who would know until the fighting started? "What happens to us if you two both get killed?" Roscoe asked. It was a question that loomed large in his mind. "Head back southeast as fast as you can," Augustus said. "Once you make it down below the Red River, you'll probably be all right. If you go east a ways, you ought to run into some herds." "Why, we'll be back," July said. "I ought to go help Captain McCrae, but we'll be back." Augustus didn't feel right about it, but he made no further effort to stop July Johnson. They let the horses rest for an hour, then put Augustus's saddle on Roscoe's big gelding and left. When they rode up on the ridge above the river, they saw again the little spark of light to the east, and made for it. "If it ain't pryin', what is this urgent business you're on?" Augustus asked. July was hesitant about answering. Roscoe and Joe had both looked at him strangely as he left, and the look bothered him. It was as if both of them were his children. Both looked to him for care. Only Janey seemed comfortable being left on the Canadian. "Well, sir, it's my wife," July said. "She's gone from home. It might be that she got stolen, too." Augustus felt that was interesting. They were both chasing women across the plains. He said no more. A man whose wife had left was apt to be sore about it and touchy. He changed the subject at once. "It was your brother Jake shot?" he asked. "Yes," July said. "I guess it was accidental, but I've got to take him back. Only I'd like to find Elmira first." They rode in silence for 7 or 8 miles over broken country. Augustus was thinking what a curious man Jake Spoon was, that he would let a woman be stolen and just go on playing cards or whatever he was doing. Every time they topped a ridge and saw the tiny flame of the campfire, July tried to calm himself, tried to remind himself that it would be almost a miracle if Elmira were there. Yet he couldn't help hoping. Sometimes he felt so bad about things that he didn't know if he could keep going much longer without knowing where she was. Finally, with the camp not more than a mile away, Augustus drew rein. He dismounted to listen. In the still night on the open plain, voices could carry a ways, and he might be able to get a sense of how many they were up against. July dismounted, too, and waited for Augustus to tell him what the plan was. They were only 100 yards from the river, and while they were listening, they heard something splash through the water downstream from where they stood. "It could be a buffalo," July whispered. "We seen a few." "More likely a horse," Augustus said. "Buffalo wouldn't cross that close to camp." He looked at the young man, worried by the nervousness in his voice. "Have you done much of this kind of thing, Mr. Johnson?" he asked. "No," July admitted. "I ain't done none. About the worst we get in Arkansas are robbers." "Let's walk our horses a little closer," Augustus said. "Don't let 'em whinny. If we can get within 100 yards of their camp, we're in good shape. Then I favor charging right into them. They'll hear us before they see us, which will scare them, and we'll be on them before they have time to think. Use your handgun and save your rifle. This'll be close-range work. If there's any left, we'll turn and make a second run at them." "We mustn't trample the women," July said. "We won't," Augustus said. "Have you ever killed?" "No," July said. "I've never had to." "I wish you'd stayed with your party," Augustus thought, but he didn't say it. Chapter 57. Dogface was dying, and he knew it. A bullet had hit a rib and turned downward into his gut. The bullet hadn't come out, and nobody was trying to get it out either. He lay on a saddle blanket in his death sweat, and all Blue Duck wanted to know was how many men there had been in the party that shot him. 3 horses, one of the Kiowas said, but Dogface couldn't remember if it had been 2 or 3. "It was getting dark," he said. One whole side of his body was wet with blood. He wanted to see the girl, but Blue Duck squatted by his side, blocking his view. "You never hit McCrae?" he asked. "He forted up behind his horse," Dogface said. "I might have put one in him, I don't know." "We'll kill him tomorrow," Monkey John said. "He ain't got no horse, and maybe he's crippled." "I doubt it," Blue Duck said. "I expect tomorrow he'll walk in and finish the rest of you, unless he does it tonight." "I hurt bad," Dogface said. "Go on and shoot me." Blue Duck laughed. "You won't catch me wasting a bullet on you," he said. "Monkey can cut your damn throat if he wants to." But Monkey wouldn't come near. Monkey John was worried, and so were the Kiowas. They all kept cocking and uncocking their pistols. They asked for whiskey, but Blue Duck wouldn't give them any. Dogface looked at the girl. She sat with her arms wrapped around her knees. Blue Duck went and saddled his horse. When he came back to the fire, he kicked the girl. He kicked her several times until she fell over and lay curled up. "What'd she do?" Dogface asked. Blue Duck walked over and kicked him in the side, causing him to scream with pain and roll off the blanket. "Mind your own goddamn business," Blue Duck said. "You gonna leave?" Monkey John asked nervously. "That's right," Blue Duck said. "I aim to look for a better crew. The whole bunch of you couldn't kill one man. You never even attacked that second bunch. It was probably just a cowboy or 2. Dogface tried to roll back on his blanket, but his strength was gone. The Kiowas had already taken his gun and divided his ammunition among themselves, so he couldn't even shoot himself. He had a razor in his pack and might have managed to cut his own throat, but his pack was on the other side of the fire, and he knew he would never be able to crawl to it. Blue Duck kicked Lorena twice more. "You ain't worth selling," Blue Duck said. "The Kiowas can have you." "What about me?" Monkey John asked. "What about my half-interest?" "I won back your half-interest," Blue Duck said. "I won the Kiowas' half, too." "Then how come you're giving her to the goddamn Kiowas?" Monkey John said. "Give her to me." "No, I want them to carve her up," Blue Duck said. "It might put some spirit in them, so they can go out tomorrow and run that old ranger to ground." "Hell, I'm as mean as they are," Monkey John said. "I can finish him if he comes around here." Blue Duck mounted. "You ain't half as mean as they are," he said. "And if McCrae comes around here, you better step quick or you'll be plugged. He got Ermoke, and Ermoke was 3 times the fighter you are." He opened his pack, took out a bottle of whiskey, and pitched it to the Indians. Then he said something to them in their language and rode away toward the river. Lorena lay where she had fallen, listening to Dogface moan. With each breath he let out a throaty moan. His wound had bloody bubbles on it. Lorena got up on her hands and knees and vomited from fear. The Kiowas were all looking at her as they drank. She wanted to run, but felt too weak. Anyway, they would soon catch her if she ran. She crawled away from the vomit and sank back, too tired and scared to move. Monkey John sat back from the fire, clutching his rifle. He didn't even look at her. He wouldn't help her. She was just in for it. "Help her, Monkey," Dogface said weakly. "Hell, I can't help her," Monkey John said. "You heard him. He gave her to them." One of the Kiowas understood the talk and was angered. He pulled his knife and stood over Dogface threateningly. Dogface continued to moan. Then the Kiowa sat on his chest, and Dogface screamed, a weak scream. The rest of the Indians jumped for him. He was too weak even to lift a hand. One Kiowa cut his belt, and 2 more pulled his pants off. Before Lorena could even turn her head, they castrated him. Another slashed a knife across his forehead and began to rip off his hair. Dogface screamed again, but it was soon muffled as the Kiowas held his head and stuffed his own bloody organs into his mouth, shoving them down his throat with the handle of a knife. His hair was soon ripped off, and the Kiowa took the scalp and tied it to his lance. Dogface struggled for breath, a pool of blood beneath his legs. Yet he wasn't dead. Lorena had her face in her arms, but she could still hear him moan and gurgle for breath. She wished he would die. It shouldn't take so long just to die. She expected any minute they would fall on her, but they didn't. What they had done to Dogface put them in a good mood, and they passed around the whiskey bottle. Monkey John was probably as scared as she was. He sat silently by the fire, his rifle in his hands, pulling at his dirty beard. Once in a while the Kiowas would jabber at him in their own language, but he didn't answer. Lying with her face almost on the ground, she was the first to hear the horses, only she didn't really know what it was or take any hope from it. It was something running. Maybe Blue Duck was coming back to reclaim her. The Kiowas, singing and drinking, 2 with bloody knives still in their hands, didn't hear the running, but Monkey John suddenly heard it. He jumped to his feet and raised his rifle, but before he could fire, she heard a gun go off in the darkness, and Monkey John dropped the rifle and slumped to a sitting position, his mouth open as if he were about to say something. Lorena saw that, and just as she saw it, the 2 horses raced right over Monkey John without touching him, and were into the Kiowas. One Kiowa screamed, a sound more hopeless and frightening even than the scream of Dogface. Before she thought about it being Gus, she saw him yank his horse almost down right in the middle of the Kiowas. He shot the one that screamed, and then the 2 that held the knives, shooting from his horse right into their chests. Another Kiowa grabbed the lance with Dogface's scalp on it, but Gus shot him before he could lift it. He shot another just as the man was picking up his rifle. The last Kiowa fled into the darkness, and Gus turned his horse after him. "Finish any that ain't finished," he said to the other man. But that man had barely dismounted before there was a shot in the darkness. He stood by his horse listening. There was another shot, and then the sound of a horse loping back. Lorena thought it was over, but Monkey John shot with his pistol at the man standing by the fire. He missed completely, and the man slowly raised his own pistol, but before he could fire, Gus rode back into the firelight and shot with his rifle, knocking Monkey John back into the pack. Then Gus turned her over and was holding her in his arms, his rifle still in one hand. "Where's Blue Duck, Lori?" he asked. "Was he here tonight?" Lorena had a hard struggle to get her mind back to Blue Duck. She had stopped talking, and though she wanted to talk, the words wouldn't come. She stared at Gus and began to cry, but she couldn't get out an answer to the question. "Was he here tonight?" Gus asked again. "Just answer that, and I won't bother you no more until you feel better." Lorena nodded. Blue Duck had been there. It was all she could do. Gus stood up. "Go back to your party," Gus said to the other man. "Go now." "I didn't shoot a one," the other man said. "You shot the whole bunch." "It ain't important," Augusta said. "I can't leave this girl, and she ain't in shape to travel fast. Go back to your party. If Laurie can ride, we'll come when we can." "Did you kill the one that ran off?" July asked. "Yes," Augusta said. "A man can't outrun a horse. You get along. There's a dangerous man loose along this river, and I doubt that deputy of yours can handle him." "What if I can't either?" July thought, looking down at Dogface. He had managed to pull his genitals out of his mouth, and still lay breathing. Looking at the pool of blood he lay in, July felt his stomach start to come up. He turned away to keep from vomiting. "I'll tidy up these dead," Augustus said. "I know this is a shock to you, Mr. Johnson. It's different from a barroom scrape in Arkansas. But you got to choke it down and get back to your people." "Are you going to kill him?" July asked, referring to Dogface. "Yes, if he don't travel soon," Augustus said. Before July was over the second ridge, he heard the gun again. Chapter 58. "Reckon we'll hear it when they fight?" Joe asked. "We won't hear it much," Roscoe said. "That campfire was way off. Anyway, maybe it's just cowboys and there won't be no fight." "But we saw Indians," Joe said. "I bet it's them." "It might be them," Roscoe admitted, "but maybe they just kept running." "I hope they didn't run this direction," Joe said. He hated to admit how scared he was, but he was a good deal more scared than he could remember being before in his life. Usually, when they camped, he was so glad to be stopped he just unrolled his blanket and went to sleep. But though he unrolled his blanket as usual, he didn't go to sleep. It was the first time he had been separated from July on the whole trip, and he was surprised at how much scarier it felt. They had been forbidden to build a fire, so all they could do was sit in the dark. Of course it wasn't cold, but a fire would have made things more cheerful. "I guess July will kill 'em," he said several times. "That Texas Ranger done killed 6, Roscoe said. "Maybe he'll kill 'em, and July can save his ammunition." Joe held his new rifle. Several times he cocked the hammer, and then eased it back down. If the Indians came, he hoped they'd wait for daylight so he'd have a better chance for a shot. Janey sat off by herself. She had seen the Indians first, and had run back to tell July. Roscoe hadn't believed her at first, but July had. He had got off several shots once the Indians started firing. Roscoe felt bothered by the fact that there were no more trees. All his life he had lived amid trees, and had given little thought to what a comfort they were. Trees had been so common that it was a shock to ride out on the plains and discover that there was a part of earth where there weren't any. Occasionally they might see a few along the rivers, but not many, and those were more bushes than trees. You couldn't lean against them, which was a thing he liked to do. He had got so he could even sleep pretty well leaning against a tree. But now July had left him on a river where there wasn't even a bush. He would have to sleep flat out on the ground, or else sit up all night. The sky was pale with moonlight, but it didn't provide enough light to see well by. Soon Roscoe began to get very nervous. Everywhere he looked, he began to see things that could have been Indians. He decided to cock his pistol in case some of the things were Indians. When he cocked his pistol, Joe cocked his rifle. "Did you see one?" he asked. "It might have been one," Roscoe said. "Where?" Janey asked. When Roscoe pointed, she immediately went running off toward it. Roscoe could hardly believe his eyes, but she had always been a wild girl. "It was just a bush," Janey said when she came back. "You better be glad of that," he said. "If it had been an Indian, you'd have got scalped." "Reckon they've had the fight yet?" Joe asked. "I'll be glad when they get back." "It might be morning before they get back," Roscoe said. "We better just rest. The minute July gets back, he'll want to go on looking for your mother." "I guess she found Dee," Joe said. "She likes Dee." "Then how come she married July, darn it?" Roscoe asked. "It was the start of all this, you know. We'd be back in Arkansas playing dominoes if she hadn't married July." Every time Roscoe tried to think back along the line of events that had led to his being in a place where there was no trees to lean against, he strayed off the line and soon got all tangled up in his thinking. It was probably better not to try and think back down the line of life. "I can't get to sleep for nothing," Joe said. Roscoe was glad he hadn't had to go with the other men. He remembered how weak he had felt that afternoon when he realized it was bullets that were hitting in the grass around him. It had sounded like bees sounded in the leaves, but of course it was bullets. While he was thinking about it, he nodded for a few minutes. It seemed like a few minutes, asleep with his gun cocked. He had a little dream about the wild pigs, not too frightening. The pigs were not as wild as they had been in real life. They were just rooting around a cabin and not trying to harm him. Yet he woke in a terrible fright and saw something incomprehensible. Janey was standing a few feet in front of him with a big rock raised over her head. She was holding it with both hands. Why would she do such a thing at that time of night? She wasn't making a sound. She just stood in front of him holding the rock. It was not until she flung it that he realized someone else was there. But someone was, someone big. In his surprise, Roscoe forgot he had a pistol. He quickly stood up. He didn't see where the rock went, but Janey suddenly dropped to her knees. She looked around at him. "Shoot at him," she said. Roscoe remembered the pistol, which was cocked, but before he could raise it, the big shadow that Janey had thrown the rock at slid close to him and shoved him. Not a hard shove, but it made him drop the pistol. He knew he was awake and not dreaming, but he didn't have any more strength than he would have had in a dream in terms of moving quick. He saw the big shadow standing by him, but he had felt no fear, and the shadow didn't shove him again. Roscoe felt warm and sleepy and sat back down. It was like he was in a warm bath. He hadn't had too many warm baths in his life, but he felt like he was in one and was ready for a long snooze. Janey was crawling, though, crawling right over his legs. "Now what are you doing?" he said before he saw that her eyes were fixed on the pistol he had dropped. She wanted the pistol, and for some reason crawled right over his legs to get to it. But before she got to it, the shadow came back. "Why, you're a fighter, ain't you?" the shadow man said. "If I wasn't in such a hurry, I'd show you a trick or two." Then he raised his arms and struck down at her. Roscoe couldn't see if it was with an axe or what, but the sound was like an axe striking wood, and Janey stopped moving and lay across his legs. "Joe?" Roscoe said. He had just remembered that he had made Joe stop cocking and uncocking his rifle so he could get to sleep. "Was that his name?" the shadow man said. Roscoe knew it must be a man, for he had a heavy voice, but he couldn't see the man's face. He just seemed to be a big shadow, and anyway, Roscoe couldn't get his mind fixed on it, or on where Joe was, or when July would be back, or on anything much. He felt so warm and tired. The big shadow stood astraddle of him and reached down for his belt, but Roscoe had let go all concern. He felt so tired. He felt everything would have to stop for a while. It was as if the darkness itself was pushing his eyelids down. Then the warm sleep took him. July found them an hour later, already stiff in death. He had raced as fast as he could over the rough country, not wanting to take the time to follow the river itself, but too unsure of his position to go very far from it. From time to time he stopped, listening for shots, but the dark plains were quiet and peaceful, though it was on them that he had just seen the most violent and terrible things he had ever witnessed in his life. The only sound he heard was the wind singing over the empty miles of grass. In the spring night the wind sang gently. July had never felt so inadequate. He was not even sure he could find his way back to where they had left the others. He was a sheriff, paid to fight when necessary, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the slaughter he had just witnessed. Captain McCrae had killed 6 men, whereas he had not even fired his gun when the old bandit was aiming at him. It had all seemed so rapid, all those deaths in a minute or two. Captain McCrae had not seemed disturbed, whereas he felt such confusion he could scarcely think. He had met rough men in Arkansas and backed several of them down and arrested them, but this was different. The dying buffalo hunter had had nothing but a patch of blood between his legs. Death and worse happened on the plains. When he saw the canyon where he had left his party, he stopped to listen but heard nothing. It made him fearful, for Joe's horse would always whinny at his. But this time there was no whinny, and he saw no horses. He dismounted and walked slowly down the canyon. Maybe they had forgotten to hobble the horses, and they had grazed away. Roscoe was forgetful in such matters. "Roscoe?" he said, when he came in sight of the camp. He could see the 3 forms on the ground as if asleep, but he knew they weren't asleep because Janey lay across Roscoe's legs. The only sound in the camp was the sound of flies buzzing on blood. July didn't want to see it. He knew he had to, but he didn't want to. He felt a terrible need to turn things back, all the way back to the time when he and Roscoe and Joe and Elmira had all been in Arkansas. He knew it could never be. Something had happened which he would never be free of. He had even lost the chance to stay and die with his people, though Captain McCrae had offered him that chance. "I'd feel better in my mind if you'd stay with your party," he had said. He had not stayed, but when he had gone, he hadn't fought either. He had done nothing but ride twice over the same stretch of prairie, while death had come to both camps. He had no doubt that if he had stayed with Roscoe and the children, it would have come to him too. The man who had killed them must be a fighter on the order of Captain McCrae. For a time, July did not go into the camp. He couldn't. He stood and listened to the flies buzz over them. He didn't want to see what had been done to them. Now, when he did find Elmira, it would only be to tell her that her son was dead, and if he lived to return to Fort Smith, it would be without Roscoe Brown, a loyal man who had never asked for much. The strange girl who could catch rabbits would catch no more rabbits. After a time, July took his knife and began to dig graves. He climbed out of the canyon and dug them on the plain. Digging with a knife was slow work, but it was the only digging tool he had. The loose dirt he threw out with his hands. He was still digging at sunup, yet the graves were pitifully shallow affairs. He would have to do better than that, or the coyotes would get the corpses. Once in a while he looked down at the bodies. Joe lay apart from the other two, sprawled on his blanket as if asleep. July began to gather rocks to pile on the graves. There were plenty along the canyon, though some had to be pried out of the dirt. While he was carrying one, he saw two riders far across the plain, black dots in the bright sunlight. His horse whinnied, eager for company. When Augustus rode up with Lorena, the Arkansas sheriff was still digging. Augustus rode over to the canyon edge and looked down. "More dead to tidy up," he said, dismounting. He had given Lorena Roscoe's horse, which had an easy gait, and was riding on the best of the Indian ponies, a skinny paint. "It's my fault," July said. "If I'd done what you said, maybe they'd be alive." "And maybe you'd be dead, and I'd have had to tidy you up," Augustus said. "Don't be reviling yourself. None of us are such fine judges of what to do." "You told me to stay," July said. "I know I did, son," Augustus said. "I'm sure you wish you had. But yesterday's gone on down the river, and you can't get it back. Go on with your digging, and I'll tidy up." He turned to Lorena and helped her down. "You stay here, darling," he said. But when he started down the canyon, Lorena followed him. She didn't want Gus to be far away. "No, I don't want you to go down there and see this mess," Augustus said. "Sit right here where you can watch me. I won't be out of sight." He turned to July. "Sit with her," he said. "She don't have much to say right now. Just sit with her, Mr. Johnson." July stopped his work. The woman didn't look at him. Her sad eyes were fixed on Captain McCrae as he made his way down the canyon. Her legs were black and blue, and there was a yellowing bruise on one cheek. She didn't turn her head or look at him at all. "My name is July Johnson," he said, to be polite, but the woman didn't appear to hear. Augustus went quickly to the camp and tied each body in a blanket. Blue Duck had been so confident of his victims that he hadn't even bothered to shoot. The deputy and the girl had been knifed, ripped open from navel to breastbone. Evidently it hadn't been enough for the girl, because her head had been smashed in too. So had the boys, probably with the butt of the rifle Gus had given him. The deputy had been castrated as well. Using saddle strings, Gus tied the blankets as tightly around them as he could. It was strange that 3 such people had been on the Canadian, but then that was the frontier. People were always wandering where they had no business being. He himself had done it and got away with it, had been a ranger in Texas rather than a lawyer in Tennessee. The 3 torn specimens he was tying into their shrouds had not been so lucky. He carried the bodies up to the prairie, laid them in their shallow graves, and helped July pile rocks on the graves, a pitiful expedient that wouldn't deter the varmints for long. In the other camp he had merely laid the buffalo hunters and the dead Kiowas in a line and left them. "I guess he took Joe's horse," July said. "Yes, and his life," Augustus said. "I'm sure he had more interest in the horse." "If you're going after him, I'd like to try and help," July said. "I got nothing to go after him on," Augustus said. "He's better mounted than us, and this ain't no place to go chasing a man who's got you out-horsed. He's headed for the purgatory this time, I bet." "The what?" July asked. "It's a river up in Colorado," Augustus said. "He's probably got another gang there. We best let him go this time." "I hate to," July said. He had begun to imagine confronting the man and shooting him down. "Son, this is a sad thing," Augustus said. "Loss of life always is. But the life is lost for good. Don't you go attempting vengeance. You've got more urgent business. If I ever run into Blue Duck, I'll kill him. But if I don't, somebody else will. He's big and mean, but sooner or later he'll meet somebody bigger and meaner. Or a snake will bite him, or a horse will fall on him, or he'll get hung, or one of his renegades will shoot him in the back, or he'll just get old and die." He went over and tightened the girth on his saddle. "Don't be trying to give back pain for pain," he said. "You can't get even measures in business like this. You best go find your wife." July looked across the river at the unending prairie. "If I find her, she'll hate me worse now," he thought. Augustus watched him mount, thinking how young he looked. He couldn't be much over 20. But he was old enough to have found a wife and lost her, not that it took long to lose one, necessarily. "Where is this Adobe Walls place?" July asked. "It ain't far down the river," Augustus said, "but I'd pass by it if I were you. Your wife ain't there. If she went up the Arkansas, I'd imagine she's up in Kansas, in one of the towns." "I would hate to miss her," July said. "If she's at Adobe Walls, you'd do better to miss her," Augustus thought, but he didn't say it. He shook hands with the young sheriff and watched him mount and ride across the river. Soon he dipped out of sight in the rough breaks to the north. When he reappeared on the vast plain, he was only a tiny speck. Augustus went to Lorena. He had spent most of the night simply holding her in his arms, hoping that body heat would finally help her stop trembling and shaking. She had not said a word so far, but she would look him in the face, which was a good sign. He had seen women captives too broken even to raise their eyes. "Come on, Laurie," he said. "Let's take a little ride." She stood up obediently, like a child. "We'll just ride over east a ways and see if we can find us some shade," Augustus said. "Then we'll loll around for a couple of weeks and let Call and the boys catch up with us. They'll be coming with the cattle pretty soon. By then I expect you'll be feeling better." Lorena didn't answer, but she mounted without help and rode beside him all day. Chapter 59. Call expected Gus to be back in a day or two. Maybe he'd have the girl, and maybe he wouldn't, but it was not likely he'd be gone long. Gus was a hard traveler and usually overtook whoever he was after promptly, arrested them or dispatched them, and got back. For a day or two he didn't give Gus's absence much thought. He was irritated with Jake Spoon for having been so troublesome and undependable, but then he partly had himself to blame for that. He should have set Jake straight before they left Lonesome Dove, informed him in no uncertain terms that the girl wasn't coming. When the third day passed and Gus wasn't back, Call began to be uneasy. Augustus had survived so much that Call didn't give his safety much thought. Even men accustomed all their lives to sudden death didn't expect it to happen to Gus McCrae. The rest of them might fall by the wayside, their mortality taking gentle or cruel forms, but Gus would just go on talking. 5 days passed, and then a week, and he didn't return. The herd crossed the Brazos without incident, and then the Trinity, and there was still no Gus. They camped west of Fort Worth, and Call allowed the men to go into town. It would be the last town they would see until they hit Ogallala, and it might be that some of them wouldn't live to hit Ogallala. He let them go carouse, keeping just the boys to help him hold the herd. Dish Boggett volunteered to stay too. He still had his thoughts on Lorena, and was not about to leave camp while there was a chance that Gus would bring her back. "Dern, he's behaving like a deacon," Soupy said. "I expect to hear him preach a sermon any day." Needle Nelson took a more charitable view. "He's just in love," he said. "He don't want to go trashing around with us." "By God, he'll wish he had before we hit Nebraska," Jasper Fant said. "You don't see me waiting. I'd like to drink a couple of more bottles of good whiskey before I have to cross any more of them cold rivers. They got real cold rivers up north, I hear. Some of them even got ice in them, I guess. If I was to see a chunk of ice in a river, I'd rope it, and we could use it to water our drinks," Bert Borum said. Bert was inordinately proud of his skill with a rope, the men thought. He was indeed quick and accurate, but the men were tired of hearing him brag on himself, and were constantly on the lookout for things he could rope that might cause him to miss. Once Bert had silenced them for a whole day by roping a coyote on the first throw, but they were not the sort of men to keep silent long. "Go rope that darn bull if you're so good at roping," Needle Nelson said. referring to the Texas bull. The bull seemed to resent it when the cowboys sat in groups. He would position himself 50 yards away and paw the earth and bellow. Needle was in favor of shooting him, but Call wouldn't allow it. "I can rope the son of a bitch fast enough," Bert said. "Getting the rope off would be the problem." "Getting you buried would be the problem if you was to rope that bull," Dish said. The fact that he chose to restrain himself and not get drunk in Fort Worth increased his sense of superiority somewhat, and many of the crew had had about all of Dish's sense of superiority as they could take, particularly since he was restraining himself for love of a young woman who clearly didn't give a hoot about him. "If you're so in love, why didn't you go bring her back and leave Gus here?" Jasper asked. "Gus is a damn sight more entertaining than you are, Dish." At that, Dish turned and jumped him, but Call soon broke it up. "If you want to fight, collect your wages first," he said. The Rainey boys were feeling grown up and wanted Newt to talk the captain into letting them go to town. "I want to try a whore," Ben Rainey said. Newt declined to make the request. "Just ask him," Ben said. "I'll ask him when we get to Nebraska," Newt said. "Yeah, and if I drown in the Red River, I won't ever get to try no whore," Ben said. Call began to be very worried about Gus. It was unusual for him to be gone so long with only one man to chase. Of course, Blue Duck might have had a gang waiting, and Gus might have ridden into an ambush. He had not done any serious fighting in years. Even P.I. had begun to worry about him. "Here we are all the way to Fort Worth, and Gus still ain't back," P.I. said. Po Campo didn't go to Fort Worth either. He sat with his back to one of the wheels of the wagon, whittling one of the little female figures he liked to carve. As he walked along during the day, he kept his eye out for promising chunks of wood, and if he saw one, would pitch it in the wagon. Then at night he whittled. He would start with a fairly big chunk, and after a week or so would have it whittled into a little wooden woman about 2 inches high. "I hope he comes back," Po Campo said. "I enjoy his acquaintance, although he doesn't like my cooking." "Well, he wasn't used to eating bugs and such when you first came," P.I. said. "I expect he'll work up a taste for it when he comes back. It never used to take him so long to catch a bandit." "He won't catch Blue Duck," Po Campo said. "Why, do you know the man?" Call asked, surprised. "I know him," Po Campo said. "There is no worse man. Only the devil is worse, and the devil won't bother us on this trip." That was surprising talk. Call looked at the old man closely, but Po Campo was just sitting by the wagon wheel, wood shavings all over his short legs. He noticed Call's look and smiled. "I lived on the Llano once," he said. "I wanted to raise sheep, but I was foolish. The wolves killed them, and the Comanches killed them, and the weather killed them. Then Blue Duck killed my 3 sons. After that I left the Llano." "Why don't you think Gus will catch him?" Call asked. Po Campo considered the question. Dietz was sitting near him. He loved to watch the old man whittle. It seemed miraculous to Dietz that Po could take a plain chunk of wood and make it into a little woman figure. He watched to see if he could figure out how it happened, but so far he had not been able to. Po Campo kept turning the wood in his hands, the shavings dropping in his lap, and then finally it would be done.